All right, so now a little bit about our speaker, but first it's kind of interesting. We talk about economists, we talk about the weather forecasters. There's a lot of data out there. It's everywhere. I mean, there's so much data, it can confuse the heck out of you, right? But what's really important is the insight that you gain from the data and then trying to create an action plan. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited about having Dr. Eyler here is on the couple of times when I saw him speak, that's what I feel he brought to the table. And as a matter of fact, although he's got a lot of data for us, he specifically reached out and said, are there any things that you want to talk about? So he really cares about us getting actionable data, right? Or information, insight. So Dr. Eyler is the president and the head of research at Economic Forensics and Analytics and the dean of the School of the Extended International Education Program at Sonoma State. He is also a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Regional Economic Analysis at Sonoma State. And he's had many years in academia, but he's also been on the board of a credit union, so he's got real-world business experience as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Eyler.
Hey folks, how we doing? Good. So everybody's full from lunch. Now you get to hear an economist talk. So what Tony tasked me to do today, folks, is kind of basically walk you through the national state economic situation and where we might be going, talk about Shasta County a little bit, talk a little bit about cannabis, and then sort of wrap up with some things about having a startup community. And what Todd said, it's great that you guys have that much activity. When we see the data about Shasta County's data, which ends up on your elected officials' desks and in Sacramento, is not as reflective of how vibrant things feel here when you're here. And so there's some things I'm going to talk to you about in terms of the way you need to use the data, and especially when you're planning. Rural California has a lot of these issues that I do some consulting as far as trying to say, look, don't worry too much about the data. What you need to do is worry about stories, and that's hard for an economist to do because I'm not very good at telling stories, but I am good at least looking at the data. And what I've tried to educate myself on is how to do both relatively well. And any economic development corporation or any city or county that wants to expand needs to do both well. I'm going to start with some national and global themes. And these are three big things that economists have been watching since late last year, but even more so this year. The first one is what's going on in the White House. In the White House, we have somebody who's constantly on his phone, constantly wants to be in the media. Very difficult to know what the next step is going to be. For example, now that we've had the meeting with North Korea, we still don't know what's going to happen. We hear a lot of news that it was okay, it was great, somewhere in the middle. We'll see how it goes. But the main thing that we've seen with the Trump administration, which has been positive for business, is we haven't seen an enormous amount of new regulatory environment come online. We've had tax cuts, we've had some reduction of regulation actually, but then we've had this trade situation. So you can see I have the port picture up here because now we're going into a thing that most economists feared when Trump got elected would actually undermine the projection of growth we had going forward in 2016. The number one thing economists warned about that the Trump administration could do that would shrink the business cycle would be to engage in a trade war. And if you look at the international economic situation right now, it has more of the rhetoric of a trade war than the actuality of it. But it could escalate in such a way that it could easily undermine how long this current business cycle could last. And the equity markets are getting very nervous that that's going to continue to escalate in general. And they got very nervous right at the beginning of the year, but now have slowly come back. So the mix of policies that are coming out of the White House have been relatively positive in net, but economists are always very concerned that it can turn south very quickly. And what I'll talk to you in a couple of slides about is what the Federal Reserve is doing parallel to this, assuming that the policies that have come out of the White House and Congress are going to start to lead to more inflation pressure. So as you may already know, if you've been looking at your phone or you watched the news about an hour before we got together today, the Federal Reserve increased interest rates again today by 25 basis points. Okay? And a lot of that is based on a graph I'll show you in just a bit. Here's what the professionals say. If you can't read this, I'm going to try to pinpoint your vision on three very important spots in my mind. This comes out of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve every quarter. And it basically says what Wall Street economists believe are going to be changes in real GDP growth, unemployment rates, and payroll employment on a quarterly average monthly. So this first part is where economists were last quarter, the left-hand column, and where they are this quarter in terms of where our economy is going in real growth. So you notice that last quarter was a little lower, pretty much across the board, except for the first quarter of 2019, than this quarter, where we've seen a little bit of growth. A lot of that increase in where economists think we're going at the national level is a function of what the White House has done to try to have gone up relatively quickly in the last, let's say, 6 or 8 months. Well, a lot of people say, well, if you look at core energy markets like gas aren't in there. That's true. But at some point, gas prices rising start to seep up through supply chains and start to affect things like logistics. So what happened with Amazon? What happened with Amazon Prime? They keep the price the same or they increase it? They increased it because they foresee fuel prices remaining relatively high in such a way to increase their cost, and they feel like they've now got you captured at the $99. So the pricing elasticity says I can raise it another 20 bucks and you're not going to worry about it. But that is a massive amount of inbound revenue to Amazon based on that one change. Right? Because that's basically a 20% change in prices of having Amazon Prime, and they can spread that over not only rising costs, but also an ability to profit off that now captured market. But that's just one example of multiple logistics markets that are affected by this over time. So we're watching this very closely, and as it creeps over that dotted line, we should expect interest rates to become more aggressive in their upward movement. I'm going to show you a couple of graphs now that economists tend to try to use as examples of predicting recession. This is the spread between the 10-year Treasury note and the 1-year Treasury bill, what in some circles could be called the yield curve. And banks and credit unions kind of run around in what you could say spread they use to recognize the yield curve. This is the 10-to-1 spread. That's a recession, that's a recession, that's a double dip recession, 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 recession. What do all those have in common? They're below that heavy line, which was supposed to be at 0, which is on that graph, which is not on that one perfectly, but the bottom line, folks, that heavy line is meant to be when the spread is equal, or 0. Okay? When that happens, that means that short-term money that banks and credit unions pay for is now equivalent to the average rate of return that you can get when you lend the money out. And that undermines my want as a bank or credit union to push money out the door very quickly, which then slows down credit markets and then slows down business investment, at least in theory. 9 out of the last 10 recessions in the United States have been predictable within 24 months of that spread going below that heavy line. And where are we at right now? We're headed down that direction. What happened today? The short end of the market got picked up again by 25 basis points. And 10-year bond markets will not react necessarily in kind, especially when you're trying to increase the amount of debt you're selling as an economy, and the world is flowing toward us while the getting is good. So we will see if that spread goes below 0, because generally speaking, that means within 24 months you're going to have a recession. Another point that economists are now watching is the corporate debt to GDP. So we've seen corporations pile on more debt, and you can see that there's a credit cycle peak here. That shaded area is a recession. Again, and we're getting close now maybe to another credit cycle peak. Some of these parts suggest that the business cycle is getting close to its peak, okay? But folks, that's okay. If you've been on this long run for 7 or 8 years, you've got to expect things to slow down a little bit, or at least have the feeling like things are going to be slowing down. And I'll talk later about how places like Shasta County might be feeling bigger, positive energy because of the way that economies work, rippling out from the urban areas to suburban to rural areas when we get there. But these things at least signal that the American economy overall is having some challenges coming, but not necessarily on top of us, and corroborates that forecasting story we saw. Good year this year, decent year next year, fading to relatively slow growth, but not necessarily recession yet. This is a graph I try to show every time I do these speeches because I think it's a different way of looking at monetary policy. This is the amount of cash that's sitting on the sidelines and is basically loanable funds, is what the banking and credit industry would call loanable funds, but has not yet found a home, also known as excess reserves. That first circle on the left-hand side is right after 9/11. And notice all those pockmarks along the horizontal axis are the monthly data for this number from 1997 forward that are so small based on where we've been that you can't differentiate them. Where we're at now is about 1.6 trillion in cash sitting on the sidelines in the American economy, waiting to go out the door, but has not yet been lent out. So we have a lot of liquidity left in this economy to go out and actually find a home if we wanted to juice the economy in different ways than simply having fiscal policy take place. But we will see, because in the regulatory environment we have in banks and credit unions, we want banks and credit unions to hold more liquidity and not lend it out. We still have remnants of the recession with us. This is one of them. And I like to show this graph because we are so far away from where we were since the beginning of this data series that it really is a fundamental change in the way we do business. So when you add all that up, the other piece to think about is that how are we going to finance these fiscal packages? So a lot of people in this room might have more after-tax income next year. Good. Save it. A lot of places that are businesses might have more after-tax income. Good. Invest it. Okay? Do something with the money. Don't go out and buy a boat. Okay? But we're going to see some of that activity. In fact, your president is talking about when you get that money home, go and spend it. That helps everybody. It does in a short burst, but not long term. Savings and investment are the way long-term economies are built, not consumption. So we will see. And the problem with that is we got to somehow finance that change. So guess what? The tax plan that was passed late last year sunsets in 2025, and thus the 2026 year will be the final year of it. Medicare and Social Security have predicted solvency crises individually about 18 months after that from the Congressional Budget Office. Okay, so folks, things are going pretty good right now, but economists are getting very worried about 7 or 8 years from now when a lot of things come to a head that we've been predicting to come to a head. And we will see if we don't get some change in the next 3 or 4 years to solve that. And California is a microcosm of that in the way we look at CalPERS. We'll see. So when you add all that up, no recession nationally before 2021. There's no reason to think that Shasta County will recess before the American economy does. So don't worry about that. Okay? So things are looking good. It's good stuff. Okay? Don't worry about the national economy for now. But keep in mind, those forecasts are fading in growth. Not negative, not recession, but what an economist would call a growth recession. Growing, but slower than average, okay? Let's talk about California briefly. California has an unemployment rate that is lower than we have ever seen. But I ask the question, so what? Right, does it matter? In other words, what we don't really measure very well as economists, to be totally honest with you, is how many people are working as 1099 workers that do not show up in this data. Places like Reading have a lot of people earning 1099 style income. And in fact, as an economic development strategy, you may want to expand that number because really, I don't care if I'm on a payroll or a 1099. I just need inbound income. And I have both coming in my house, thank God. But the bottom line is that for measuring what's going on with the labor force and what's going on, a lot of what I'm going to show you in the next 10, 20 minutes is really a statement about the old way of looking at labor force and thinking about what it really means on the ground. Is this really a reflection of the true situation we're in terms of labor? These are the top regional growth areas since the bottom was hit. In that third column, the percentage growth since the bottom is how this is sorted. So the California average is at the bottom. And can anybody pick out the general theme geographically of these areas by looking at them briefly?
Bay Area.
Bay Area, coastal, urban, good. Folks, this is a natural pattern. The urban areas that are connected to the coastal areas in California are usually the places that grow first, grow robustly, and then other places start to catch up. Some variations on that theme are places like Stockton and Lodi. Wow, really? And the answer is, yeah, guess why? Because of the logistics connected both to Sacramento and the Bay Area that exist in Stockton and Lodi. And as housing prices fell precipitously in those places, it generated economic development opportunities in those places. As commercial real estate fell in cost, same thing. Okay? So Fresno, Napa, which is kind of an anomaly in there, Merced, not necessarily a major player historically, but big enough to grab gains where they were coming out of the core Bay Area, out of LA, etc., over the last 7 or 8 years. What is missing, which you don't see there, obviously, is Shasta County. Shasta County grew a little slower than that, about 12%. Well, that's the labor market story in terms of the growth sense, and it's been relatively robust in California, but I want to show you something real quick. I get asked a lot of questions. The last 2 years, economists have asked a lot of questions, or have been asked a lot of questions about automation. And how many people in here, when they were kids, had books that talked about automation in, like, you know, in the auto industry? Does anybody remember that stuff, where automation was a big deal in the conversion of the auto industry and manufacturing? It's not new. Robotics is nothing as far as a new thing. But let me show you something. There's a lot of contesting of markets, and this guy greeted me at a banking conference. And one of the things I sell as an economics professor is that you could go into banking to get basic sales and marketing experience and customer service. Well, folks, that's going away very slowly. Perfect English came up, meant to basically answer my question at full speed and not to engage me beyond that. Okay? This is just one of many examples where we're seeing a conversion from labor to capital where the market can be so-called contested. This could easily proliferate into other services, into construction, into more manufacturing, into customer service across a wide array of industries. So as labor markets get tighter in California, and if wages start to go up, and there's not a lot of relief in sight, but interest rates remain relatively low, you might see more and more businesses that you never would have thought would have experimented with robotics and using a hub to do training and downloads and updating of the software inside the robotics to engage in that kind of investment and then wipe out opportunities that classically have been entryways for new labor force. We'll see. Watch for this. It's coming. This is a jobs forecast that came out of Caltrans and the California Economy Project in terms of job growth between now and 2026. They actually forecasted to 2050, but that's, to me, forecasting jobs to 20 or 30 years beyond is just pure lunacy. This at least gives us a feeling of what they said between now and the middle of the next decade. The only negative number here is farm. Why would farming actually have negative growth in California overall? Nice and loud. Automation, mechanization, exactly. So the prediction or the assumption in this model is that we'll have more mechanization in agriculture, and that's because the markets are easily contested. Okay, the Central Valley will just take on more and more, and the bulk of California agriculture will become mechanized. Is that going to be true in let's say, if I ever watched that one, budding industries like cannabis? What do you think? Everybody doing okay? Okay, so maybe I put you on the spot because some of you know how cannabis is grown and some of you don't. The supposition is that if cannabis actually does get a lot of momentum behind it, it will be hand-picked or not necessarily mechanized on the front end. That's an assumption in this model, but almost all other parts of agriculture are going to be threatened to have more mechanization, hence negative growth. Second assumption is immigration law is predicted to change. Okay, if immigration law changes in such a way that we lose part of our workforce nag, what do you think happens to food prices? Take a guess. Is yes, up or down? Outstanding. Up. Good. So while this might seem very minor on the surface, if this prediction comes true, it will increase the cost of living in California because there's so many supply chains in California that depend on agriculture. And since y'all are in a place where there is some ag happening, keep that in mind going forward, how much pressure you see along all the supply chain of agriculture, not just in the field, but in food processors, logistics, if we go to autonomous trucking. A lot of things we'd say, oh, this is automatic for job growth. Be very cautious that it's an automatic for job growth. And this is contrasted to the total, which is about 8% growth between now and the middle of the next decade. And I'll come back and show you the same graph with Shasta County in just a second. So to wrap up on California, the current prediction is California is going to grow faster than the US economy and in a sense be the engine of that growth, and perhaps is going to grow beyond 2021. So things are going very good. So much of that is predicated upon what happens in a 25-mile radius around South San Francisco, going north, east, and south. Okay? If then we start to see tech fall apart a little bit, or a reduction of venture funding, or some flight of funding away from the Bay Area, the California economy is going to start to wobble a little bit. Okay, but for right now, that doesn't look like it's happening. Sorry, I keep hitting these buttons. Housing markets are supported because interest rates are still relatively low. Incomes look like they're going to continue to rise, especially if wages have, let's say, some more pressure on them because of the cost of living to rise. Hopefully they outpace that cost of living and get real growth in income. But there's some challenges, folks. Poverty rates have increased across California during this recovery period. This is an anomaly, historically speaking, because generally speaking, poverty rates either flatten out a little bit or don't grow at the speed that they have in this recovery period, and we're getting more income and wealth inequality in the state. Okay? Drought is still a factor. Okay? No matter what snow cap you have, when I drove up here, I noticed Mount Shasta still has snow on it. That's great, good. And the water will ripple down at some point, but we don't distribute water in California very well. One of the main reasons why there's a three-state proposal that's now on your ballot is because of water. Okay, so if you've ever seen the movie Chinatown, it's now starting to come out in November on your ballot. The tax revenues in California too, your governor's very concerned that tax revenues in California are at threat. Well, that's because basically we generate most of our tax income in Sacramento from personal income and capital gains. Hence, if the Bay Area wobbles a little bit, there's not a lot of deal flow, and you don't get these sort of big bursts of capital gains revenue that move their way to Sacramento and finance a big bucket of spending, that makes everything more tricky to do in Sacramento. So all those pieces add up to that. California still remains the engine of the United States economy. There's still some caveats, and notice I didn't say anything here about pensions yet. Okay? How many people in here are CalPERS? Okay, how many people here have some kind of defined benefits or defined contribution package? It's okay, my hand's nice enough, come on. Okay, so CalPERS, if you're in the system, is not a worry short of the fact that it might go bankrupt in the next 10 or 15 years, but we'll see how it goes, and don't let that freak you out. Okay, I want to make sure you're awake. So Shasta County, let's now start talking about Shasta County. That's basically the wrap on California, but it obviously drives everything else. The number one message, folks, that you'll see at the end is that the national and state context are huge drivers of what goes on here. The best thing Shasta County can do is figure out where it has niche and invest in that niche. Jobs growth-wise, about 8,000 jobs since the bottom was hit, and mostly shown here, okay? The top two are in rehiring teachers and in farm workers in terms of percentage growth. But in bodies, it's basically restaurants, professional services, and education. And that's okay. The problem is what do all three of those have in common? What population do they serve? A population outside Shasta County or one inside Shasta County? Inside. The beauty of what we heard today is it's more focused on the outside, and that's where all the economic development juice is. Okay, so when economies recover, they usually recover based on outside focus rather than inside focus, but Shasta County can look and say, well, we now have a lot more of that, but initially coming out of the recession, we're more inward looking. And that's okay, you're not alone in that. It's one thing you try to break away from because it's so easy to grow jobs that basically look at your population as its main market, because the other ones are tougher to sustain. I'm going to show you what's the so-called employment to population ratio now. This is California, and if you can see the numbers, you can see that basically since 1990, this has wavered in California from 48 to about 46.5, and the slope is very slow to go down. Okay? And that's because we've seen some obvious recessions, and you can see those. This is the early 90s recession, the dot-com recession, the Great Recession, and now the recovery. Okay? Here's Shasta County. Employment to population, meaning the number of people employed of who lives here, who has a job, okay? So notice that this has got a lot more violence in it, and the movement after the recession was relatively steep. Was there flight of people away from Shasta County a little bit that were working people as the recession unfolded? Sure, and this is classic. Right? They went where the jobs were more plentiful. And this is, again, rural California and rural areas in general have this fate during recession, especially deep ones. But we've seen it come back. So that's good. But notice how far it is from where it peaked and where we started in 1990. And if you put a trend through this, it would probably have a little bit, let's say, steeper downhill slope than California. But this is also true of rural California. The key, when you bring employers in, or employees in, will they stick around? And in fact, will they actually have a job? Another big data problem, this measures payroll workers, not people earning 1099. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is labor force growth. Now, labor force is the addition of folks that have a job and live locally to those that are seeking work but do not have a job, or the unemployed. The two together are labor force. Notice the labor force growth. What is the theme again here? Same basic counties we saw before that had a lot of growth. Now, contrast that to this picture, which is the slowest growth labor force areas And notice Shasta County, by the way we measure it, is the second to lowest labor force growth county in California. Or labor force metropolitan statistical area, or how we measure MSA. But Shasta County's there. Negative 3.7. We've actually lost labor force from this area. How many people agree with that assessment? Okay, so the data at least follow the anecdote. That's good. What are the themes geographically of the areas on this slide? Mainly what? Rural areas in California. Okay? Not a shocker, but it reminds you that there's the same basic fate exists with most of rural California as we recover from recession, but there's also opportunity in this graph. If this is what's happened, you can identify that problem and try to figure out how to keep it from happening next time. And one of the biggest economic development challenges for rural California is not bringing in workers and employers, but keeping them. Okay? If you've been in Reading or you've been in the North State, let's say 30 years, and you've watched 3 recessions come through, what is the theme that you can say in each one of those recessions, generally speaking? We've had some flight of people, then they come back, some flight of people, then they come back. It's this sort of swinging pendulum depending on what's going on. San Francisco, as a city, has had a little bit of that, but the amplitude of those changes is much smaller than rural California because people are drawn immediately toward lower housing prices and lower commercial prices. It begins the wheel spinning. And there's so many jobs and so many networks that makes it easier to grow. The key is keeping what you bring here and rooting it here in such a way that makes you more bulletproof when the recession finally comes. And really, furthermore, being more positive about it, how you can juice those companies to grow more rapidly when things are going really well. Another challenge in the data is this is the analog to GDP in Shasta County, Butte County, and California since 2002 annually to 2016. The 2017 data are coming out later this year. But this shows a tale that even during the last growth phase, this sort of boxed in area shows what's happened in Shasta County. A lot of negative growth years of incomes in this region. Okay? Even when construction was still cooking along, the last recession drew people away and did not bring them back hard enough to actually keep it going until the second recession hit. And when the second recession hit, it was tough and remains still somewhat of a challenge, but check it out. If you can see what's been happening since about 2013, Shasta County's come up and actually beat the state, beat Butte County easy, but the state still is a little bit higher than the growth of Shasta County until just 2016, okay? Same pattern. Rural California finally catches up to the state average over time because the other areas fade when they get so big that wages and cost of living start to catch up to incomes. And we're now seeing that in California. If we get 3 or 4 more years, folks, of growth, the beauty of that, we've got a long runway before we have to worry about the national and state economies undermining some of the potential growth in places like Reading. One thing that a lot of economies struggle with too is how do I measure prices, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics does not put out a lot of great data on cost of living. Here's actually a cost of living index, believe it or not, for Shasta County. This is the growth of prices. This is published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis when they do the graph we just looked at, real versus nominal GDP. And because Shasta County is the so-called metropolitan statistic area, believe it or not, the MSA status means there's an economist in Washington that is actually running these data for Shasta County and publishing them, and this is what hits elected officials' desks as far as what's going on in the cost of living. And it's the only statistic we have for this for Shasta. But the cost of living increased as housing prices went up in the last decade, fell during the recession, kind of bottomed out, but still sort of slightly growing, not negative growth, but falling in growth, which is good. It sort of allows the economy to get back and has been grown by businesses with more after-tax income. Tax cuts, reducing regulatory environments, allowing for credit markets to expand, in a sense, generating more growth, including the new fiscal spending package. But notice there's a fade there. And you can notice the fade is a little bit more explicit if you look at the annual change in the forecast, where we're seeing it fade to below 2% come 2020 and 2021. Now, if you just look at these two things on the surface, we usually talk about growth and where we're going with respect to growth and recession through this number. When this number dips below 3, it is below the long-term average of the United States, and it really has no projection to go above 3 in earnest over the next 3 or 4 years, and that's been true, generally speaking, since the recession ended. But notice there's no negative numbers here either. So right now, the top 100 Wall Street economists who do forecasting every day of the week are not predicting an American recession before 2021. Okay? All things considered. Okay? So this will be by far the longest growth period in American history since the Second World War, but will also be one of the slowest. But the beauty of that I'll come back to later in terms of where we might be looking when the recession comes, because it will come. It might be relatively mild. We will see. The other thing I want to show you is unemployment. So Tony alluded to the idea that the unemployment rate here in Shasta County is low, but maybe not as low as everybody wants it to be. Since the recession, we have seen some changes or shifts in the way that people work in such a way that the classic way of looking at unemployment may not be a great gauge of where we're going in the economy. And notice that there's really no number differential there from 4%, it's plus or minus 1 or 2 tenths of a percent. 4%, folks, if you remember your basic macro college class, 4% was always sort of in a hand-wavy way, a statement of full employment. Okay? Well, full employment, just to give you a heads up, is not just based on the unemployment rate being relatively low. It depends on also what's going on with wages and prices. If you have relatively low unemployment, but wages are not increasing, it means there's a latent labor force still sitting out there where there's some workforce doing something else besides payroll employment, such that there's no pressure on wages, even with relatively low unemployment rates. Okay, so in a lot of communities in California, we are down at historic lows of unemployment, but wage growth is just now suddenly starting to kick up. So there's really no change in the unemployment rate because there's no expectation there's going to be an increase in the labor force and really no change in wages that's going to undermine hiring in such a way to lift that number up. So those are good numbers. It's just a little bit of a head scratcher for economists because this is something we would never predict, generally speaking, that we would be sort of flatlined at about 4% in unemployment, because that means things should be going pretty good, but those low growth numbers suggest wages are not expected to rise in earnest. Here's a map of equity markets since 2008, and you can see this is the bottom, at the bottom of the recession, March 9, 2009. This is the S&P 500 on a monthly basis. And you can see where we have been since right after Trump got elected, but you can see it peaked right before the start of the year and has gone down. This is about 6 weeks old now because of when I had wanted to put all the slides together. And we've seen it kind of creep back up to that peak. But folks, the real meaning of this picture is twofold. One is that we have been on a really nice steep run since Trump got elected. So part one of this graph is to say that we should expect that growth at some point has got to peak and fall back a little bit. And when you've been on this long run, which is the second point, it isn't like this peak just appeared out of nowhere. For almost 10 years, we've seen trended growth in equity markets. At some point, investors are going to want to take profits off the table. And as interest rates creep up, like they did again today, that's going to slowly undermine what you get out of equity markets. And we should expect some twist here at some point. One of the biggest issues that economists get asked, I get this asked all the time, which is kind of a crazy question because if I knew for sure I wouldn't be in front of you, I'd be sitting on a beach with a headset and just making money left and right, is when this is really going to turn completely in trend. Nobody knows that for sure. But if you think about the fundamentals of the economy and the slow, steady pace with which interest rates are rising, all those are really good things to keep equity markets or keep investors at least relatively confident about the future. So we'll see. One might ask though is why did you have this sort of quick dive? And the quick dive was because inflation predictions right after we saw the tax cuts and the omnibus spending package come out and the fear of a trade war, all three mean that inflation is likely to rise. When inflation rises and interest rates follow, interest rates rising undermines equity values. But we're seeing some moderation of that a little bit, and that's why we're seeing stock markets go back up again. But watch this a little bit. Do not spend every day just going bananas over the movement of this number. Okay, it'll give you stomach problems when you don't need to have them. This is the graph that is the reason why we saw the interest rates go up today. This is actually the exact graph that hits the desk at the Federal Reserve when they make interest rate choices about prices. It's not the CPI, it's what's called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Deflator Index. And you can see at the very far end, which is in the shadowed part here, this is what's been happening for about the last 18, 20 months. And right behind it, you can see where prices dove down. And if you can differentiate, there's a blue line, which is total PCE prices, which include food and energy. And then the red line does not include food and energy. And we think about generally the focus of economists' work is on core, or without food and energy prices. You can see that there's a deep dive in the total piece because we had commodities markets gluts for a little while, and now that has recovered, and now we're seeing that seep through the supply chain. So gas prices, for example, as you know probably only too well, going a little bit more steadily ever since. Here's Butte County, and here's California. Following the same basic rhythms, but rural California is more violent in these changes because it relies more, pardon me, on external markets than, let's say, more urban California. But the bottom line is that we are seeing some moderation, at least going into 2017, and the data will update themselves in a few months, like I said before. But this is good. These are economic development opportunities because you have a relatively low cost of living here, okay? You can't rely on that forever because guess what? If you really start to grow and things start to go good, what's going to happen to housing prices naturally? They're going to go up, okay? But that might be good if you own, because that means some wealth recovery takes place. It's juxtaposed to people that need to rent, and rental prices go up, okay? So I'm going to talk about housing in just a second. But these are good data in terms of showing that there's economic development opportunity here based on cost of living. This is jobs to housing. 1% or 1 as a ratio, meaning jobs and housing equal each other, is not necessarily a norm to follow, but it suggests that basically you're housing all your workers or have opportunities for every worker to be housed here, which means they can live and work in the same place. Shasta and Butte counties basically have more housing than they do jobs, which makes a lot of sense. The cool thing about that is it keeps housing prices relatively low and affordable. The bad thing is you don't recover wealth as quickly. What do you think the Bay Area, which is the last data set on this side, looks like? Above that red line or below? Above, okay, and quite a bit. Okay. So one thing you can use when you look at jobs to housing, and this is actually from 2000 all the way to, I think, February 2018, is the movement of that graph usually dictates what's happening with housing prices. Because workers come in, they want to stay where they are, they buy houses, and housing prices go up. And it's one way of gauging how tight your housing market may be. That's certainly reflective of the Bay Area. This is the graph we saw before. The only thing is my editing staff flip-flopped California and Shasta County on this. Shasta is actually the red line, not the blue. I apologize for that. But notice that 7.93 is what California grew. You can see the negative in farming and everything else positive. Believe it or not, the construction number for Shasta County is negative to the tune of about 5.5% to 6% going forward the next 10 years. What assumption do you think exists that you'd see negative construction growth in Shasta County versus positive for the state?
Just inflating, instead of paying jobs in the metropolitan area.
Yeah, or a lack of need because they don't see a lot of building or a lot of commercial expansion here, as the case may be. Outstanding. That flight is probably the #1 thing. But overall, jobs growth in Shasta County is about 10.5% in this prediction. Now, I want to make a quick pause here because I kind of flew through the first time I showed you the California data, now we're back at it. The #1 reason, folks, and maybe you didn't catch this subtly, Caltrans and the California Economy Project out of UCLA Anderson's forecast unit, out of Anderson Business School's forecast unit, did this together. Why would Caltrans care about jobs and population growth? Yep, an expansion of infrastructure. They're trying to figure out where houses should go vis-a-vis their planning for transportation infrastructure, okay? So when they see growth like this, is it possible that there's state and federal dollars that are out there to be had in places like Shasta County to help on transportation infrastructure, given these job numbers are growing faster than the state on average? The answer is yes. Use these data to your advantage when you think about infrastructure parallel to residential and business attraction, retention, and expansion.
Is that an anomaly there with health and education being off the chart compared to the state?
Agreed. I think the key there is recognizing that it's growing. This is percentage change from a relatively small number. And the idea is that if we're aging here, a lot of it's health. So one thing about these data, and I'm glad you brought that up, one of the things about these data, folks, that you also have to be very careful about, but this is, again, what's hitting your elected official's desk as the quickest way to find a forecast that's comparable across all 58 counties. Aging populace is equated in an economist's mind to an expansion of healthcare demand. Okay? That may not happen. But folks, would it be good to see an expansion of healthcare demand and potentially healthcare supply in Shasta County? What do you think? Kind of a mixed bag of reactions out there. Do people not like to stay healthy? No, I'm trying to be serious. The one thing about it is that you need to think about the way an economist thinks sometimes. This is really about saying that if you have an aging populace and they just simply want more hospital stays because they have to, you're going to have to expand it, right? But is it good also to think about this as an expansion of health that is more externally focused? And I'll come back to that in just a second. Thank you for picking that up. And you can see that's really the core. It's all in services. Let's start wrapping up by talking about housing. So in housing markets, these are the current data that we're getting out of Zillow. And folks, we can argue whether truly Zillow, California Association of Realtors, something in between are the real data. It's really about trend and where we're going. I'm going to show you some graphs on that in a minute. But right now, or at least as of February, which is a couple months old now, just under 240 in Shasta County, about 275 in Butte County. But look at San Francisco and Marin County, which are number 1 and 2 in the state. Okay? And these are median home prices across all possible purchases, condo, single-family homes. This is rental prices. So about $1,300 a month in Shasta County and about $4,300 a month in San Francisco. Okay? These are economic development opportunities, folks. Okay? In terms of attracting places that want to have rooted employees. Okay? There's a way of using this to your advantage. But it may shock you that those are the prices. Now, I've also had asked me, does this mean there's a real estate bubble coming to the Bay Area? And once that bubble bursts, there's going to be this 500,000 person diaspora from the Bay Area and then finding themselves looking at Redding to come and double the population of Redding. Don't bet on it overnight. But think about it that there are some niche opportunities out there and these data reflect that. I'll talk more about regionality in just a minute. So these are the dynamics. I said just the statement of where they are. This is as of February. This is the growth in California. 1 year, 2 year growth, just under 20% housing price growth from February 2016 to February 2018 for the state overall, believe it or not. Since the bottom, using current prices, California has not recovered all of its wealth that was lost in the recession. But since the top has no data, because since the top, we've actually we've reacquired the top. This is Sacramento. So Sacramento has not quite reached the top again, where the peak was in terms of current pricing in real estate. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. So these are the core areas that economists look at for housing markets in California. Now, what I want to do is I want to contrast that to regional, which is this one. This is Shasta County. So Shasta County is a little slower growth, but growing. Still, since the bottom, not quite 100% higher than when we hit rock bottom here, and still has some growth to the top. Now folks, the key to that is the following. These are current prices, not inflation adjusted. So if you think about the real wealth that was lost and potentially gained in housing, Shasta County is still real wealth-wise, if you're a homeowner, under where we were at the top. California, same, just like we just saw. Sacramento, same, and Butte County, same. Okay, same basic dynamic. All right, we still have room to grow. And that's really the idea here, is that when we think about, God, housing prices are so high, especially throughout other parts of California, we still have room to grow from where we were. Okay, there's still real wealth out there to be made. So we'll see. I think the housing market still have a couple more years at least running up, which is good. And this is what's happened since the top. Commuting. So these maps are a little old, but they showcase something about Shasta County that is good and bad. These data come from what's known as the Longitudinal Employment and Housing Database of the Census, and they're meant to put together tax records where you live, employee records where you work, and try to show how many people are on the move every day from place to place. In 2008, about 16,000 people came into Shasta County to work, and about 12,000 left Shasta County to go some other place, okay? But about 46,000 people who work here live here, okay? So what's that mean? It means that on average, if you live in Shasta County, you likely work in Shasta County. And in 2015, which is the latest data, the inbound and outbound balanced each other out, but not much growth, right? The labor force change basically meant you got about the same amount of people, all right? But the idea there is that once you bring people in, you have to provide them with an opportunity here because they seemingly don't, on average, leave or go. They want jobs here, and that's good, okay? But the geography kind of dictates that as well. If I showed you this for the Bay Area, there's about 1 million people inbound every day, and about 250,000 outbound, because a lot of people live in rings around the Bay Area and use it as their core source of employment. Okay? So the dynamics in California really depend on geography in so many ways. Okay, so to wrap up in terms of the total speech, that's on the data side. I'm now going to talk more qualitatively, and we're going to start with a fun topic, which is weed. So just to give you a quick reminder, supply chains work from production to distribution to retail. So we have cold manufacturing, you need commercial space and workers again, and you could also say you need logistics depending if you want to travel with it over distance. Finally, you have retail and beyond. Now this is important in my mind, because if you know you have indigenous supply and you have manufacturing possibilities, is it possible that you can use the retail possibilities as something that integrates a lot of different industries at once? Meaning, you can have niche producers on the science side. You can have tourism links. You can be an export market in niche ways. And you can also become very, very competitive in those markets where you might not have another play. How do people feel like cannabis is going so far here? Good, bad, or indifferent? Let's go good. How many people think that things are going very well? How many people think things are going very bad? Okay, so it must be so-so. Or nobody wants to reveal that they're, engaged one way or the other. Okay. So there's our friend, the cannabis leaf. So, given that that's the basic setup of the market, and folks, my bottom line when I talk about this stuff is that this is an agricultural market. Just treat it like that. The thing is, there's such a cultural trickiness to it in California, really in the United States overall, because we're so puritanical about certain things and so weird about other things, that we got to see it as that, okay? But when we think about that, where are we going to put it, right? Who is actually going to open their arms to it from a regulatory standpoint? And what we've seen in the last year and a half is this weird political hot potato once Prop 64 was passed, is I don't want to make a decision, you make it. Well, I don't want to make a decision, you make it. So it's gone from state to county back and city and back, and they're playing tennis with it all over the place. But part of that's because you have to think about where it's going to go, and people are a little NIMBY about having, 20 hoop houses next door to their house. We have to think about whether it's an export product. Folks, just to give you a heads up, we have been exporting cannabis from California for a long time. Okay? If you didn't know that already. So I went to Chico State as an undergraduate, and Chico State was a hub of retail no matter which way you sliced it. There are opportunities now to take that retail market and make it into something beyond. That export piece is possible, and also exportation in terms of tourism. Can you have niche cannabis opportunities that will drive the world towards you because you're a center of the research piece of it, both medically and recreationally? Those opportunities are still out there a year and a half on when we got the green light in California, okay? The jobs. So Tony wanted me to talk a little bit about the jobs, and I asked him what's going on. Are these jobs wanted? Do we want to have 1,000 people working somewhere along this supply chain in Shasta County? And you don't have to raise your hand and say yes or no. It's a rhetorical question, but folks, it's one that every community in California has got to start answering, okay? So there is that issue, and whether or not they're sustainable or not is going to be anybody's guess, but folks, are there competitive advantages here that make sense to expand this industry? Okay, again, all rhetorical, but the things from an economic development standpoint you've got to be thinking about. If you're going to embrace it, you're going to have to take on the whole 9 yards on it to really feel all the effects. So, when integrated, and this is my point, for every job, you get 2 more jobs when vertically integrated, meaning that you have production, manufacturing and distribution, and retail all in the same place. When you vertically integrate this industry, because of its agricultural foundation, for every job you bring in, you get 2 more. You get $500,000 of business revenue, and you get $275,000 of wages out of those 3 jobs. And that means that not each one of those jobs is getting paid $90,000 a piece, but their reverberated impact on the economy has all those pieces involved. The other industries are these: construction, trucking, professional services across the board, medical and tourism, they're all engaged, okay? And this is why you vertically integrate, because there's economic growth that comes from it. But it scares a lot of people, and it should a little bit, because there's public safety issues and there's other costs in society that if you haven't got that nailed, there's problems in the wake. So, Two biggest things we're worried about is, will it strip the land use and make it not its best practice, but furthermore, are we collecting taxes in the right way? We've totally dropped the ball on this thing in the last 18 months, in my mind. We needed to do better. We'll see how we do the next 18. So, another thing to talk about, and I asked about this, and we had a great lead up on this, is a place for startups. I'm going to move through this relatively quickly because we heard a lot of this. Folks, in my mind, it boils down to a couple of things. If you really want to be a place for startups, given your location, there's some basic things you got to think about. One, can you market lifestyle, and is this why startups are going to want to be here? And I don't mean start here, but root here. That's key. Are the politics in place? And it sounds like they are. Proximity to I-5 makes it very, very unique to this area. Chico, as a place that's got, let's say, a budding labor force and budding ideas from science, is good. But I-5 does not go right through town as far as a logistics hub. So if you have logistics-based businesses that come out as entrepreneurship, it'll be trickier in Chico than it will be in Reading. Okay? Some of the challenges, is there enough venture capital here? We heard some great stories about venture capital, and that's super. Okay? The key is whether or not it can remain focused here over time. When things go south, will it want to move south geographically as well? Can you keep that money here and keep the idea flowing? That's the biggest problem with startups and why a lot of them end up in the Bay Area, because there are hundreds of deals to be made, not tens. Okay? So think about that in terms of its longevity. And do you have, in a sense, the government partnership in terms of financing a lot of these things as well? So I think Reading, from the stories I've heard and what I know about the area, is a great place to continue this work. It's good that this momentum is in place. Okay? The big test will come when we see the economy peak and start to go down. That'll talk about the rooting, and there's still time to make that happen, which is great. So, aerospace, life sciences, engineering across all disciplines, being a logistics hub, telehealth hubbing for all of rural California, potentially some of rural Oregon, and then medical tourism. Folks, the piece that I see as the nexus of cannabis is if you get a niche product enough on the medical side, you could have some people come to Reading for tourism reasons, engage in some, let's say, medical procedure, or let's say the use of medical cannabis, and see if it works while they're here, and then wrap tourism around them. There's a lot of places in California that are looking at that nexus as a way of expanding tourism, is having the cannabis piece alongside of it, but very scientifically, not just, we're going to open 12 hash bars and hopefully you're going to cruise over. You know, that's Chico. So, sorry, since I'm an alum, I can say that. So let's now wrap up completely. The point of those is that the macro environment looks really good for Reading to continue this work. What are we going to watch? The geopolitics. Our man Trump can either make this thing work out or can totally sink it, and he's got to watch himself on that phone. If you're looking for signs of recession, delinquencies rising at banks and credit unions and credit cards are really some of the easiest ways to see if we're disengaging from normal procedure, meaning if outside of normal credit scoring, we start to see a rise in delinquencies at the higher levels of credit scores, that's when you can say, whoa, things are not going well anymore. This is exactly what happened in the last recession. We don't see any sign of that right now, folks. That spread, that graph I showed you, that's key. The unpredictability of price and interest rate movements. Right now, prices and interest rates are moving very, very predictably. If that takes off for some reason, or the Fed gets more aggressive, that will easily start to undermine the growth forecast for our economy. So watch that too. Every indicator looks good. I'm not betting the 2021 yet. You may have noticed in my slides I kind of waved my hands a little bit, but 2020 looks pretty good. It's really tough to turn a cruise ship this size around. 2020 we're probably going to be just fine. It's about another 18 months minimum, which is great. But a lot of the things we've seen in the last 6 months give me a little concern, because a lot of us were predicting this is the one thing that can throw a broomstick in the bike wheel, was this trade war and too much fiscal policy when it was not needed. We'll see. For Shasta County, water, weed, housing, and jobs. Okay? Take that macro context, which you really can't affect. What can you affect? You can affect how you use land and really kind of how water gets into the conversation, if it does at all right now, but keep it in the conversation, because at some point you'll be talking about drought again. The cannabis situation, where to build houses, how many to build, why you're building it, and ultimately which kind of jobs you want to bring here. And a lot of it boils back down to the entrepreneurship we've seen and heard about today otherwise. So if you have any other questions, I can take those. I know we're a little over time, but I have a little time to answer any questions. So thank you again for having me, and let it rip if you got a question. Anybody? No way, come on. Come on. You guys are just as bad as all my students. Yes, sir.
Where, I mean, there's a lot of talk on the feds now trying to get the natural rate. And then, so now the measured lift on the short end, the non-corresponding lift on the far end. And it seems like if, we're going to have somewhat, they're going to drive the inversion of the curve.
Mm-hmm. Which is classic for a central bank. So you should expect that every time the interest rate goes up, and we're expecting at least one more, and I think there's actually going to be two more if the inflation rate continues to show upward momentum. I think we'll see one in September and one in December. That'll push up that short end, and we'll kind of tip over based on that. Absolutely. The key is really how aggressive the bond markets are on the long side and whether or not we get some relief there. But of course, nobody really wants those rates to go up, because as those rates go up, it more quickly undermines. And that's why you get that snapback effect. If I showed you that graph, it usually doesn't end in a nice, easy U shape. It usually V's, because the long markets snap after a certain point when the spread goes negative, and then the long markets say, okay, we're done, and that pulls all the money out, and then the rates go up to try to reattract the money.
Can I follow up?
Please.
On the severity of the recession, they can be vastly different in both severity and length.
Yes.
So, and then with the elongated expansion, we have to be getting close to the peak.
Yes.
So when we come down the other side, what would be your call in terms of the severity of what's going to come our way?
So the question, if you didn't hear it, is that on the other side of this business cycle, on the positive side, when we come out, what's the severity of the recession to come? History suggests that the severity will be relatively mild, because this growth phase has been relatively mild. But a lot of it depends on what, in a sense, causes it. If it's caused by slowly rising interest rates that kind of ease into a soft landing, because we don't want to see relatively rapid inflation in the American mind of inflation, then it'll be a very soft recession. And it kind of might drift around zero and maybe pop above positive and really almost look like the Australian model, where they didn't have a real recession for 25 years, but really didn't grow much more than 1.5% over those 25 years annually. That'll be the key, because what will happen is that Americans are going to get very nervous if we have another 2 or 3 years of 1.5%, 1.25%, 0.75 growth. They're going to say, what are you going to do about it? And then there'll be another bit of juice to go in. So by increasing rates, at least you have a little bit of room to go back down if you need to provide more juice to the economy. But right now, it looks like all signs suggest there's no financial reason for us to have a severe recession or for it to last an extremely long period of time. Most economists are saying it's going to be like the dot-com recession. If anything, it's not going to be a second Great Recession as far as we can tell. Yes, ma'am.
So for those wishing to keep an eye on this conversation moving forward, can you recommend a couple of sources that you find reliable that we can refer to, short of us emailing you on the
Sure.
screen?
Sure, but email me for sure if you're struggling to find that source. But the question was about sources of what to watch. So everything I showed you today is publicly available information. The two big sources you can do, if you go to what's called Fred at the St. Louis Fed, which is their main database, if you type in spread, it will give you multiple bond spreads that you can watch and you can just have as a bookmark on your browser. And when you hit it, it will automatically update to the latest data, so you can just track it every morning if you want to. Now, I don't recommend that in terms of tracking it every day, because I don't want you to get, a lot of, ailments. But at the same time, you can just say, well, I think Rob said when it goes below zero, we might have some trickiness. So you might want to look at it once a month and say, okay, well, here it is now, and here it is now, and here it is now. And if you're in banking or credit unions, you're going to have this updated naturally every month, most of the time anyway. So that would be one place to go. And the Fred database has got everything that you can think of in terms of GDP growth, what's going on in banking, delinquencies, and a lot of things I tend to watch at the national level. In terms of what's going on in Shasta County, as a result of that, business formation and watching what's going on in terms of commercial real estate and the vacancy rates, looking at housing prices, thinking just about the activity you see in small counties. I think it's more qualitative than quantitative, because the quantitative is so hard sometimes to believe. It's really about hearing what people are saying and sort of the positive energy, which again is hard for an economist to say. But it's almost psychological than it is economic on a day-to-day basis, because the economy is so much driven by the bigger context that you cannot control easily locally. But the local piece is really, how can I fit in that context best, and is the community feeling like that things are going well? That's key. And you'll see it in retail. You can look at sales tax revenue too and kind of get a feel on that. those are some of the things you can watch locally that give you a feeling, but a lot of that, again, is going to be driven by what's going on above anyway. Yes, sir.
So with marijuana, you're talking about being one of the big four things to watch here, and you also said we've dropped the ball in the last 18 months as a state.
Yeah.
How much do you contribute that to the Fed's stance on marijuana, and do you see that as a safe bet moving forward for a community that's getting into that? Because there seems to be clearly some things that are up in the air in that regard.
Yeah, so that's a great point. As you may know, banking and credit unions have not been able to provide an overt credit market to that industry yet, which probably has slowed down its growth like it would in any other economy. So that's a problem. And if it doesn't go off of Schedule 1 and get rescheduled, this sort of lingering lack of an overt credit market that's not based on somebody doing just a personal loan or using purely equity markets is going to continue as far as the eye can see. What we hear, at least if you believe the industry and you believe what's going on in Congress, if Trump is not reelected in 2020 and Congress becomes Democratic majority and the Democrat goes in the White House in 2020, then between 2020 and 2024, cannabis will be nationalized in terms of recreational use. That's what we're hearing. And hence it'll be rescheduled. And that will open up all the credit markets, and the bet on the come you made here will then pay off. But I would assume in the next 10 years, regardless, there'll be enough political pressure that it'll go live nationally. So that's my take. It seems like there's a lot of political momentum to get that done under the right political auspices. We'll see. But yeah, but the idea is that, if you bet on that and it doesn't come, do you just sort of tread water, and how economically viable that is, that's anybody's guess. But everybody I've talked to said, it depends on those two assumptions, and then that 4-year gap, we should see something give. We'll see. It'll be very intriguing come November, just as a starting place.
Dr. Eyler, you pointed out aerospace.
Yeah.
As an opportunity. Do you have anything behind that?
I do. There are communities in California that have attracted older, wanting to pre-retire engineering in aerospace that come as a cluster, 3 or 4 of them, and then continue working in aerospace and using broadband as a way of moving files. So that's very dependent on broadband as an infrastructure. Without that, you won't have that. But if it comes, you can sell that kind of industry a lifestyle, a place to retire, but a place you can still continue to work in an industry that otherwise would be in an urban area. Okay, but it's dependent upon that infrastructure. And it could be also dependent upon airport infrastructure as well, as far as having meetings and being able to go beyond what you talked about at length, which was spectacular. Good. Okay, folks, just one more reminder. Let's see if I can go back one slide. Oh, no, Tony, I'm going in your slides, I'm sorry. That's my Twitter handle, and that's my email. If you're driving away later today, you remember something, email me or tweet me up, and I'll take care of you. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Eyler. Thank you for coming, and sorry we ran a little late. And by the way, we have something here for Dr. Eyler. We've got.
Am I on?
Yeah.
So the wine is good stuff. Enjoy.
Wow.
We want him to be a brand